Of business is a members' business debate on motion 19293 in the name of Alec Cole-Hamilton on Hong Kong. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put. Can I ask those members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now? And I call on Alec Cole-Hamilton to open the debate. Mr Cole-Hamilton, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'm very grateful for the time to raise this issue in Parliament today. I'm also grateful to members of the Labour Party and the Green Party who signed my motion expressing concern about the seriousness of the current situation in Hong Kong. Presiding Officer, it is right that this Parliament takes an interest in what is happening in there because the ties between us are very strong. You can see in the Hong Kong road signs from Aberdeen Street to Dundas Street, countless Scots call Hong Kong home and vice versa, but the situation there has become a powder keg. For 5 months, we have seen protest after protest. Views are becoming more and more entrenched, and the situation shows no signs of abating. One of the most densely populated, high-tech modern cities on the planet is now regularly brought to a standstill. Thousands of protesters have been arrested, among them 750 children. And there have been serious casualties, a journalist blinded in one eye, over 1,000 people treated at hospital for injuries. And earlier this month, we saw the footage of a teenager shot in the chest at point-blank range by a police officer with live ammunition. The international community needs to keep up the pressure for a full independent investigation into police violence in Hong Kong. Amnesty International says that the approach by the police violates international human rights laws and standards. As such, trust in the police has evaporated. People are afraid. So such an investigation is in the interest of the Hong Kong administration as well. Of course, we have to acknowledge that some demonstrations have developed a violent edge. Anger has flared into street skirmishes. Innocent people and buildings have been caught up in mob violence. Protesters have trashed the world-renowned MTR and other things that they perceive to be linked to the Chinese mainland. This escalation can be traced back to the severe police response to what were initially peaceful protests. Indeed, those protests began from legitimate peaceful demands for human rights. 1 million people filled the streets on 9th of June alone, and with good reason. These protests were sparked by the extradition bill that every member in this chamber will be aware of. As members will be aware, it would have seen people sent to face trial in mainland China amid fears that the Communist Party would prosecute for political reasons. That bill has now been formally withdrawn, but these threats to the right of free assembly and freedom of speech still exist. And we've seen the introduction of the anti-mask law. People protesting peacefully in the pursuit of universal suffrage have been sprayed with tear gas and arbitrarily arrested. They just want to enjoy the same freedoms that we all do here. Take Joshua Wong. On Tuesday, this prominent democracy activist was barred from running in the local elections next month. The problem? His political views. Just imagine that for a moment. And it happened despite his stating that he doesn't even support independence for Hong Kong, which was the apparent cause for his disqualification. Joshua Wong called it political screening, and we should be alarmed that the public are being denied the right to channel their concerns through the ballot box. Protesters want the UK government to make a clear and unambiguous statement that the Sino-British Joint Declaration has been breached, meaning China is now in contravention of international law. Liberal Democrat colleagues have been making that point for some time. The UK government says it is, quote, fully committed to upholding Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy and its rights and freedoms as enshrined in the one country, two systems framework. But where is the evidence of this? Last month, 130 MPs called for the UK government to urge Commonwealth nations to grant people from Hong Kong citizenship as an insurance policy. They include the last governor, Chris Patten, Ian Blackford of the SNP, and my colleague, Alistair Carmichael, a patron himself of Hong Kong Watch, as Paddy Ashdown was before him. Paddy Ashdown also campaigned tirelessly for the Hong Kong British national overseas passport holders to be offered the right to live and work in the UK if China reneged on the promises it made during the handover. Presiding Officer, it is hard to avoid the conclusion that we have now reached that point. Indeed, the 1984 Sino-British Treaty was, after all, an international agreement lodged with the United Nations. It remains in force. It obliges both signatories to adhere to the agreed terms. But the Chinese Foreign Ministry has described it as a historical document that no longer has any practical significance. Presiding Officer, it is important that both the United Kingdom and the international community not shy away from what is happening in Hong Kong. Beijing has tightened its control over that city, and it was chilling to see China's President Xi Jinping recent comments whilst visiting Nepal, a message many believed was intended for Hong Kong. He said that any attempt to divide China will end in bodies smashed and bones ground to powder. Nobody should talk about another human being in those sorts of hideous, graphic terms, wherever they are and whatever their cause. These concerns need to be addressed, not suppressed and not silenced. As one protester told The Guardian, this is now about the soul of Hong Kong. It is about the future of one country, two systems. It is about the future of democracy in a place that has the closest ties with the United Kingdom. It is time that this Parliament stood with the people of Hong Kong in support for their rights and freedoms. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Cole-Hamilton. Can I say to public in the gallery, I understand why you wish to applaud, but it's not permitted in Parliament. Only members may applaud. I now call Tom Arthur to be followed by Donald Cameron. Mr Arthur, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I begin by thanking Alec Cole-Hamilton for bringing this important debate to the Chamber. Hong Kong is a city very dear to me. It's one I have had the pleasure of visiting on several occasions, and where a very dear friend and his wife and a new son live. And I was speaking with my friend only a matter of a couple of hours ago to hear from a voice on the ground of what his reflections were and his experience of living in Hong Kong, where he has lived now for the past almost 5 years. And it's deeply concerning. I'll come to that in a moment. I want to pick up on some of the remarks that Alex Cole-Hamilton made with regard to the 1984 joint agreement. And I am completely in agreement with Mr Cole-Hamilton's remarks that this is an international treaty that is lodged at the UN and it must be respected. But I think we are to some extent running up against the cold, hard reality of realpolitik. Because I think if we are honest and understand what the motivations of that treaty were, it was fundamentally a means of a peaceful transition of sovereignty from Britain to China over Hong Kong, and it allowed the UK to save face as the sun finally set on the last remnants of the British Empire. Indeed, the UK government attempts in the negotiations in the 1970s to broker a compromise which would recognise Chinese sovereignty but enable British control were dismissed, and then Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping made very clear to the UK government that there was nothing stopping him walking across Boundary Street and taking Hong Kong Island and Kowloon, which had, of course, originally been ceded in perpetuity. So that is the reality that we faced. I think there also has to be a very keen recognition of the role that Hong Kong plays within the political consciousness of Beijing. It was a symbol and an emblem of the unequal treaties of the mid-19th century, and it also the events in Hong Kong have to be understood in the context of the People's Republic of China as a multi-ethnic and multi-linguistic state, where there are pressures in other territories for greater autonomy, which we of course understand that Beijing is resisting. So I think it is important to establish that context. I think where we can lend our voices is in tracking back to why China, the People's Republic of China, in the first place engaged in that process. This was about legitimacy. It was about legitimacy in regards to demonstrating that China was what is now characterised as intent on a peaceful rise, and that Hong Kong should become a part of China peacefully, and engaging in international norms and in an international treaty of the 1984 agreement. And I think it's incumbent upon us to remind our friends in China of that obligation, and also to be alive to what is a key aspect of the relationship between Hong Kong and Beijing, which is that we understand that Beijing will want to be able to demonstrate to Taiwan that there is a future for Taiwan as part of the People's Republic of China, as it politically incorporated, where it can enjoy a degree of autonomy. And it is incumbent, if Beijing wants to demonstrate that and for that to be credible, that Hong Kong's special status, at least up until 2047, as agreed in the 1984 agreement, is maintained. I think it is worth noting where we are now in terms of the environment on the ground in Hong Kong, however, because of course there are 5 demands, 4 of which concern the actions of the police, and I think the calls for an investigation are vitally important, and I think it's right that the international community backs them, not least because for any functioning polity, or any polity to function, it requires confidence within the police services, and that has clearly been significantly damaged in recent months, and I think an inquiry can go some way to addressing that concern. I think one of the final demands for universal suffrage is indeed more complicated, and while it is something I would naturally wish to see granted to all peoples of the world, it poses challenges to see how that could possibly be implemented in Hong Kong in the near future, though it's an aspiration I share with the people of Hong Kong. That is one slogan that appears on walls. Another slogan that is appearing on walls across Hong Kong and in underpasses, which is quite worrying, is that if we burn, you burn. And the reflection of my friend in Hong Kong was that what has emerged now is a new status quo, where there will be peace and calm and order Monday to Friday afternoon, and then at the weekends a lockdown commences, and we see restrictions on the MTR, we see shops closing early, and tragically what this is now having is a significantly detrimental impact upon Hong Kong's economy. We will be aware of the increased vacancy rates in hotels, now up to 60%. We are aware of the number of tourists who are no longer visiting Hong Kong. But what is also becoming apparent is many of those who have chosen to live and to work in Hong Kong, who contribute to it being such a dynamic and vibrant international city, are now reconsidering their options. Indeed, my own friend is now reflecting upon whether a future in Hong Kong is the best choice for his friends, for his family and himself. So I think what is absolutely vital is that we can return to a period of stability.
I'm loath to interrupt, and I'm absolutely fascinated by the speeches, but I'm afraid you have overrun by 2 minutes. So
thank you very
last
much,
sentence, please.
I thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I thank Alec Cole-Hamilton for bringing this motion forward, and I hope we can see a return to peace and stability in Hong Kong as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There aren't as many speakers. I can be a bit freer with others as well. If I've been like that with Mr Arthur, I feel compelled to allow members. I can see Ms Bailey giving me the eagle look to give her an extra minute. She frightens me sometimes. But not enough, Ms Bailey. I call Donald Cameron to be followed by Jackie Bailey.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. She frightens us all, I think. I appreciate the opportunity to speak in this debate on what is an incredibly serious issue, and I thank Alec Cole-Hamilton for introducing this motion for a members' debate. Clearly, we don't often discuss international issues here, in large part because they are reserved mostly, but it remains plainly important that on occasion we're able to do so. And I'm sure we all appreciate that the ongoing situation in Hong Kong is a highly sensitive issue and of deep concern to us all, and I share many of the thoughts expressed by both Alec Cole-Hamilton and Tom Arthur. I was particularly struck by Tom Arthur's speech and his suggestion, which I think is correct, about the legitimacy that China sought by agreeing to the 1984 agreement, and that the solution to this problem going forward in the future may in fact lie in the past. And I think there could be much in that. Hong Kong, of course, has always been a strong ally of the United Kingdom since 1997. And there is a deep and meaningful connection both between Britain and Hong Kong, but also Scotland and Hong Kong. I first visited Hong Kong just prior to the handover in 1997, when the UK government and the British Army still obviously had a visible and important presence. But I've also returned since the handover, and whilst there were some obvious changes, Hong Kong retained its unique and dynamic character as an international hub for business, but also as a beacon of democratic government in the region. But it's important to paint a fair picture. It's still one of the most expensive cities in the world, and the gap between rich and poor has widened considerably. And before I entered politics, just after university, I worked for a think tank in Washington, D.C. And from there, from general interest in the Far East and traveling there, we've all been acutely conscious about China's approach to Hong Kong and shown concern about China's approach to the freedoms that Hong Kong residents have enjoyed in comparison to other cities in China. But the one country, two systems model and framework of 1984, which has been referred to, was a model which was agreed to last for 50 years, allowing Hong Kong a degree of autonomy and freedom. And I hope that, that this recent situation can serve to reinforce the principles behind that agreement and that timeline, plainly. And I also welcome the fact that the UK government has at least reiterated its commitment to that agreement. The Foreign Secretary has said explicitly that the UK expects China to live up to its obligations under that treaty, and indeed as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, under its wider international human rights law obligations, and indeed the UN Charter. Like many in this chamber, I remain concerned that at present that agreement of 1984 is being put to the test, and I would reiterate the need for dialogue and diplomacy on the part of both the UK government and the Chinese government to find a solution. Some of the protests have been peaceful, but others have not been, and there has been a degree of significant violence and mayhem. And others have mentioned the police. There is a real problem in that the hatred directed towards the police is very evident. One example is the fact that protesters are attacking stations in Hong Kong because the railway system in Hong Kong was used to transport the police, and therefore it has become the subject of the ire of protesters. And that's a real problem insofar as a society that loses trust and confidence in its police force, I think, is in deep trouble, not just in the short term, but also the long term. Now, the excessive force used by the Hong Kong authorities has plainly not helped. And just as I would hope protesters can conduct themselves peacefully, so I urge the government of Hong Kong to engage in a meaningful and peaceful dialogue with protesters. I do welcome the fact that the initial cause of these protests, the extradition bill, has been withdrawn by the chief executive of the government of Hong Kong, and steps which have been taken by that government to improve the credibility of, for instance, the Police Complaints Council are also welcome. But we must be under no illusion, Deputy Presiding Officer, that the root cause of these protests is about much more than specific issues of governance. People in Hong Kong, young and old, are concerned about the erosion of their freedoms and their liberties, and they rightly expect the level of freedom that many of us take for granted and should be afforded to them under the Chinese-British Joint Declaration should continue. And we must do all that we can to ensure that a peaceful resolution to this situation is eventually achieved. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Mr Cameron. I call Jackie Bailey to be followed by Patrick Hardy. Ms Bailey, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I need to clearly practice smiling because that was my friendly look that I was giving you. But can I say to Donald Cameron, I am not remotely frightening, provided, of course, that you agree with me. So that's fine. Just like that to put that on the record. But let me start by thanking Alex Cole-Hamilton for bringing this debate to the Chamber. It is an issue that is close to my heart, and I'm encouraged by the level of support that both the motion and this debate has received. I know all too well the close ties that Scotland and Hong Kong have together. It was, in fact, merchants from Scotland that first colonised Hong Kong, and the city's streets bear many old Scottish names. Indeed, companies like Jardine Matheson continue a long association with Hong Kong. I was also born in Hong Kong, actually in Aberdeen, to a Scottish mother and a Portuguese father. So I spent my formative years there, and all my earliest and happiest memories involve Hong Kong. Its people, its landscape, its culture is, for me, unique. Its determination to embrace and practice democratic values has gained Hong Kong much-deserved respect around the world. But it is a shame, and I have to say this, that the British government waited until very late in the day to bring democracy to Hong Kong, content to have its status as a colony with a governor and limited democracy to remain for far too long. I'll resist too much of a walk down memory lane, presiding officer, but I do remember clearly the debates in my household about the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which came into effect in 1997. There was much debate about China's intentions, but the declaration guaranteed democratic freedoms and recognised human rights for the people of Hong Kong. This was very welcome, and I supported the return of Hong Kong to China. But that treaty contained undertakings, important undertakings, that, and I quote, Hong Kong's previous capitalist economic system and lifestyle shall remain unchanged for 50 years. And that Chinese and Hong Kong law would maintain, and I quote again, freedom of the person, of speech, of the press, of assembly, to name but a few. And these principles are critically important, but they are the very principles that are under threat due to the actions of the Hong Kong government and the frankly ineffectual leadership of Carrie Lam, the chief executive. Now, I have enormous respect for China. The reaction to these protests, though, from official representatives and the press has been genuinely disappointing, because it is in direct contradiction to the agreements laid out within the Sino-British Declaration. Now, of course, Hong Kong and China are going to disagree. They're allowed to disagree. But the declaration means that China has no right to impose its own policies in terms of the Chinese Penal Code or any other Chinese state policy. China is obligated by this binding declaration to respect the principle of the one country, two systems arrangement, something that we all passionately believed in, not least because of the economic importance of Hong Kong to China. Hong Kong and its people were granted the power to practice autonomy within that declaration, and China must not forget that. Now, I have never in my lifetime, and some members would unkindly say I've been around for a while, but I have never in my lifetime seen the scale of protests that are taking place on the streets of Hong Kong. I have never seen the Hong Kong police used in the way they've been used, frequently resorting to the indiscriminate and unlawful use of non-lethal weapons such as tear gas. They have engaged in a clear pattern of unnecessary and excessive force during arrests of protesters. But, you know, that said, presiding officer, I condemn violence on all sides. As parliamentarians, it is right for us to shine a light on this issue. It is right to demand an independent investigation into the allegations of police abuse, because these protests have increasingly signalled, for me at least, a systematic suppression of freedom of speech, as well as a dismissal of the Sino-British Joint Declaration. This is not what I expect from China, and I sincerely hope that an agreement can be reached so that Hong Kong citizens can continue to enjoy the rights they deserve. But, you know, it doesn't let Britain off the hook either, because they have a legal and moral obligation to the people of Hong Kong, obligations to the Hong Kong citizens that served in our armed forces, and wider obligations to the people that live there. So the UK government needs to step up. Presiding officer, there is an expression about having an iron fist in a velvet glove to signal determination to achieve your ends. Let me suggest respectfully to the Chinese state that what we need here is less of the iron fist and much more of the velvet glove.
Thank you very much. And I call Patrick Harvey, followed by Daniel Johnson. Mr Johnson is the last speaker in the open debate. Mr Harvey.
Presiding officer, I'm grateful to be called in this debate, and I thank Alex Cole-Hamilton for bringing the motion to the chamber. And can I say to Jackie Baillie, the only thing I'm intimidated by is following in a debate like this someone with so clearly a deep personal connection to the issues being discussed. And I'm sure the sincerity and depth of feeling in Jackie Baillie's speech would be respected by everybody across the chamber. There are a number of members who have begun by placing this in historical context, and I think it's right to do that. The motion reflects the legal and moral duty that the UK has to the people of Hong Kong, and I think it's worth just remembering where that duty originates. It originates with some of the most repulsive and abusive actions in the shameful history of British colonialism, where the use of military as well as economic force was used to force Indian farmers to grow opium, to export to China, merely in order to achieve an economic benefit. The huge social, economic and personal cost that played out from that, including 2 wars, the end of which resulted in the claim, the UK's claim ownership over Hong Kong. The cost of that can't be underestimated. And when we, as the inheritors of that moral responsibility, seek to put right the wrongs that were committed by UK imperialism and colonialism, the only legitimate way to do so is to ensure that the people who are left behind gain control over their own lives. Transfer to democratic institutions is the only legitimate way to end the moral responsibility, or to respond to the moral responsibility that we have as a result of active colonialism. That responsibility absolutely needs to be recognising the place of democracy in the people of Hong Kong, in their future, and I would say not just for the decades covered by the treaty. In relation to the use of violence, however, I do say that states need to be held to a higher standard. And there are times when I think all of us would recognise that people struggling against anti-democratic forces, people struggling against autocratic and dictatorial regimes, have needed to resort to violence. States should be held to a higher standard. How does this responsibility play out in relation to Scotland? Because we are not the UK, we are not the legal entity that is party to that treaty. We do have issues that we need to take seriously in terms of our own responsibility, because the use of tear gas that's been referred to against civilian protesters does include tear gas manufactured by arms companies which have received funding from the Scottish Government. Chemring, I would certainly give way.
Cabinet Secretary.
The member might not have been in the chamber when I made clear on the 26th of June that the Stevenson plant of Chemring, which has received funding in order to sustain permanent jobs in North Ayrshire, do not produce tear gas.
Patrick Harvey.
I didn't say that the same plant produces it. I said that the same company produces it. Chemring, which just so recently was touting its wares at the arms fair in London, is responsible. And if we seek to fund, for any other purposes, companies that are responsible for the production and export of munitions that are used against civilian protesters in this way, we bear a responsibility for that. And indeed, some of the work that's been done by the Ferret and my colleague Ross Greer has shown that the Scottish Government's usual response, that they do not fund the production of munitions, simply doesn't stand up, because a recent application did include drawing attention to munitions as a key growth area for Chemring. This does need to be held to a higher degree of scrutiny and responsibility. And I'll close, Presiding Officer, by saying that in general, the Scottish Government does say that they are willing to support civilian sectors, including the blue light sector. This is a euphemism that is intended to put us in mind of fire engines and ambulances. The blue light sector clearly includes the use of weapons by police forces, and that has included the Hong Kong police force. I think we should hold ourselves to a higher standard. Public money should not be going to any company involved with the arms trade. But even if it does, even if the Scottish Government wants to maintain that option, it absolutely should redefine its approach to what it calls the blue light sector, so that authoritarian police forces into whose hands these munitions will be put are not being provided with any support or any funding on the Scottish taxpayers' account. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Harvey. I call Daniel Johnson, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. It's always somewhat hazardous speaking towards the end of a debate like this, because invariably the things that you have wanted to say have been said by others, and possibly more effectively and more powerfully than you can muster yourself. But nonetheless, I too would like to begin by saying how much I thank Alex Cole-Hamilton for bringing this debate, because Hong Kong is a place close to my heart too. My wife was born and brought up in Hong Kong. She's half Chinese, and Hong Kong is somewhere that we talk about regularly at home to make sure that our daughters, both of whom have Chinese middle names, are aware of their cultural background and heritage. And so over the last few months, it's been hugely worrying for us to receive the reports from friends and family who are still in Hong Kong about what they are facing. The genuine personal worry that they have about their safety, both in terms of their immediate safety as they wander the streets, many of whom just simply will not venture out at night. I thought previously kind of unthinkable in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is thought of as a very safe city, but also, more importantly, their safety in terms of their future in Hong Kong. Because the matter of fact is this, is that for months now, millions of people have been taking to the streets in a territory whose population is not much bigger than Scotland's. And I think it is with huge worry that we've seen the escalation undoubtedly provoked by the police's heavy-handed response, and that has taken what was a peaceful and orderly process and turned it into something all the more violent, with all the more worrying consequences that could have for Hong Kong and indeed the future of China. But I think others have been right to focus on the history. We've discussed the history of Britain in Hong Kong and indeed the Opium Wars. We've talked about the deep historic links between Scotland and Hong Kong. And I think it is important that actually that direct link between the Opium Wars and Scots in Hong Kong is brought forward. Jardine and Matheson have been mentioned, two Scottish individuals who directly sought and brought about the Opium Wars themselves. UK imperialism is a heritage and a legacy we must all be mindful of and take ownership of. A heritage which as much belonged to Scots as it did other people in the United Kingdom. And likewise, it was very late in the day, at the very 11th hour, that the UK administration in Hong Kong extended the franchise. But nonetheless, democracy is much bigger than simply elections. Democracy is about accountability and transparency. It's about freedom of expression. It's about rule of law. And while we may not have been as fulsome in the implementation of democracy in Hong Kong as we should have been, nonetheless, those things were entrenched in Hong Kong. And those were at the very heart of the Sino-British Declaration in 1984, that again, others have been absolutely right that we need to return to, because those principles were important. They were important not just for the future of Hong Kong, but I would actually argue for the future of China. Because China, over the last 30 years, since that declaration, has changed beyond all recognition. And I would argue, in no small part, because of the Sino-British Declaration. Hong Kong gave China a window into the world, access to the global stage. It benefited as much from those things established in Hong Kong as much as it gained simply an additional territory. So I would ask China, bearing in mind the historical context we have all made out, to think very carefully before it breaks those principles set out in the Sino-British Declaration. But above all else, it must embark on dialogue. And I think Alex Cole-Hamilton was absolutely right to emphasise the point that we must have an inquiry into the police actions in Hong Kong. But I think it goes further than that. We must have a very serious and concerted effort of dialogue, both from the Hong Kong authorities and the Chinese authorities, to seek a way forward that has broad support, that has popular support, because that's ultimately what democracy means. So at this moment, I would say this. We implore the Hong Kong authorities to engage in those talks. We ask China to listen, and we ask the UK government to remind gently and respectfully about those principles that both the UK government and the Chinese government signed up to in 1984. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Johnson. I call on Fiona Hislop to close for the government. Cabinet Secretary, please.
Presiding Officer, I welcome this debate and would like to thank Alex Cole-Hamilton for raising this motion on the current situation in Hong Kong, and thank you to my colleagues for their considered contributions. And I'd like to pay tribute particularly to the contribution of Jackie Bailey for her personal reflection and considered political analysis. I want to take each of the points in the motion in order. On the current situation, the Scottish Government is seriously concerned at the situation in Hong Kong and, of course, the recent violent clashes between protesters and the police. It is clear that political dialogue is the only way to resolve the situation, and we urge all communities to engage in good faith to achieve a peaceful resolution. We welcome the Hong Kong Chief Executive's announcement of the withdrawal of the extradition bill and initial steps towards dialogue, but this dialogue must continue. On the close ties between Scotland and Hong Kong, the motion is right to recall the long and close ties between Scotland and Hong Kong, which are evident throughout the territory. Indeed, those ties between Scotland and Hong Kong go back for many, many generations. And they can be seen, as we've heard, in the place names such as Aberdeen Harbour, in the thistle of Jardine Matheson's Emlyn, and I think there's been a reflection in the debate of that imperial heritage that we should also be very conscious of. And of course in the presence of the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, which was founded in 1864 by Thomas Sutherland from North East Scotland. And contemporary ties between Scotland and Hong Kong are also strong in education, business, tourism and culture. For example, Scotland's exports of goods and services, excluding oil and gas, to Hong Kong were worth £255 million in 2017, and this was 15% higher than the previous year. And there are 930 students from Hong Kong studying at higher education institutions in Scotland. But of course, many of those connections are family connections and those of friendship. And we heard, even in this debate itself, from Tom Arthur, Jackie Bailey, and also Daniel Johnson. I also have family in Hong Kong. So I think across this chamber, you'll probably find a number of people with those connections. And I was particularly interested to hear those personal reflections, particularly from Tom Arthur and Jackie Bailey, about their experiences and connections. Ultimately, I think we all want to see a strong, stable, prosperous Hong Kong. On human rights currently under threat, as I set out in my answer to a parliamentary question on the 26th of June, the Scottish Government's position is that it is vital that Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy and the rights and freedoms that are set out in the legally binding Sino-British Joint Declaration, which was registered at the UN, are respected in full. And that is the best way to ensure the rights and freedoms of the people of Hong Kong are upheld. We aspire for Scotland to act as a good global citizen, drawing on our experience at home to promote tolerance and respect for human rights in other countries. And we want to ensure that our commitment to securing democracy and the rule of law and human rights across the world is communicated. And we expect China to fulfil its human rights obligations with respect to Hong Kong. And I think particularly in response to Alex Cole-Hamilton's raising the issue of the right to stand for political office, the right to stand for election is a fundamental right enshrined in the basic law of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region and the Hong Kong Bill of Rights. This right should be fully respected, and I'm concerned that it is not. We fully support the right to peaceful protest, which has been exercised by the majority over many months. There is no excuse for violence, and we condemn the minority of hardcore protesters who insist on using violence. However, it is vital that the response by the police is proportionate, and I think we've heard that from a number of members of concerns there. On concerns, calls for a full independent investigation into the reported police violence. There must be a robust, credible and independent investigation into events at Hong Kong. An inquiry into reported police violence is an important step in healing divisions and rebuilding trust that will support the process of dialogue and resolution. And on the UK's legal and moral duty to the people of Hong Kong and support for their rights, freedoms and genuine democracy, I'd also like to reaffirm the Scottish Government's support for the One Country, Two Systems legal framework, which is guaranteed by the legally binding Joint Declaration of 1984 and enshrined in Hong Kong basic law. And we urge the UK government to continue to assert its strong commitment to this agreement, just as we heard from Jackie Bailey, the responsibility for the Chinese government to also carry out its responsibility there. These are issues that were raised both by Tom Arthur and David Cameron, and Donald Cameron. And Donald Cameron also made the point that the system is meant to last for 50 years, and is still within that period. And as I set out in answer to a parliamentary question on the 26th of June, the Minister for Trade, Investment and Innovation has written to the Chinese Consul General outlining the Scottish Government's position. So I'd like to finish by restating the Scottish Government's view that the way forward must be through constructive and meaningful dialogue with all sides that address the concerns of the people of Hong Kong. The Hong Kong's Chief Executive's announcement of the withdrawal of the extradition bill and initial steps towards dialogue is of course welcome, but this dialogue must be structured and transparent to successfully bring about a peaceful resolution. The dialogue must take on broad views, allowing wide engagement, and must genuinely listen to the concerns of people of Hong Kong. This is the only way to resolve the situation and ensure Hong Kong's stability and prosperity endures. This has been a very thoughtful debate. I think it's very timely, and I think our message must be of solidarity to the people of Hong Kong, best wishes for them for a stable and secure future. But there's a great deal of responsibility, I think, still lies on the shoulders of the Chinese government and indeed the UK government to help secure that situation. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes the debate. And can I thank all members for their very thoughtful contributions? I found them extremely interesting. I suspend Parliament till 2:30.